What is comprehension and how does it affect reading ability? I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. If you're interested in literacy from a global perspective, please like and subscribe. So comprehension is something that is often overlooked when it comes to reading today. There's much more of an emphasis now decoding, which is sounding out words. And if you watch some of my early videos, I talk about that. But comprehension is understanding of what you read. And many times children will be able to decode. That means they're able to sound out words, but they're not able to understand. And so in comprehension, you are not reading if you don't understand what you read. This should be a logical thing. Reading out loud beautifully does no good unless you actually understand what you're reading. And many children, especially English language learners and children with disabilities, or just children who have had not enough exposure to text, some of those more vulnerable children that I talk about a lot, poor children especially, who may not have had a lot of exposure to text, have not read a lot, often have comprehension problems. And comprehension strategies are what helps students to understand how to read. So those include things like visualization. That's the easiest one. So visualization is where children just in their heads, they visualize about what they're reading and make pictures in their brain. That's the easiest strategy. And then there's others like note-taking, like rereading, like fixing what you read, taking what you read and doing some more research. That's a strategy. So there are inferences. That means making sense of something that's not stated directly. There are all these different strategies. Now, strategies have gotten kind of a bad name in the last few years, and in the United States, that's largely because of media coverage. One particular strategy called cooing. And so cooing is where the child is reading a word and doesn't understand the word, or isn't able to sound the word out either. And the child uses pictures to help understand what that word is. Now that's been given kind of a bad name because media coverage, that's been very negative. And there are lots of YouTube videos out there talking about how cooing is bad and how it's really cheating, because instead of the child learning how to read, because again, reading is thought of as decoding, there's this idea that the child is guessing or using things to help them, and it's like a crutch, that the child should not be doing that. The problem with that is that only 60 to 70% of words can be read phonetically, and it's not cheating if you use a picture to help you with that. And then the other problem is meaning. There might be a word that the child can sound out, but the child doesn't know what it is. So the child may use those pictures to help them. But again, there's been such an emphasis in the media about cueing being bad and reading strategies being bad that the idea of comprehension is really being overlooked. And again, about when I was in school 20 to 30 years ago, comprehension was the thing. Phonics was overlooked. So it's this push-pull in reading. Again, what we might call the reading wars. But children need strategies because, again, not every word is decodable. And even if it was, it doesn't help you to learn what the word means and to understand the text if you don't have picture support. And that's just one example of a strategy, cueing. There are many others. But the best story I have about this is when I was in China, there was a child who was a very good phonetic reader, and we were reading a story, and the story was talking about Helen Keller and how she had a doll. The kid was like, "What's a doll?" And there was a picture of a doll, and he recognized, "Oh, that's a doll." He knew that the word was sounding like doll, but he did not know what the word meant, so he had to use the picture to help him. And that's not a bad thing if pictures can help you. But again, there are many reading strategies. Cueing is just one of them. So strategies do help students learn. That's just how it is. Another thing that aids comprehension is if students read something that's on their level. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about levels, reading levels, because of the way that they are designed. So there used to be this idea that reading levels were all over the place. They weren't matching. There's actually been research now that shows that most reading levels do match. There are many different ways to measure reading levels. There's something called Lexile. Your school uses star rating. They use Atos. There's CBM, which is a way to measure a child's reading level. That's an online program. There's all these different ways to map assessment. And all these assessments give a child's reading level. The problem with reading levels is they don't take into account what's called schema. And schema is a student's background knowledge. So there are many students out there who have limited world knowledge. And I'm going to talk about world knowledge in another video because it's really, really important. But the students may not have vocabularies and may not have background knowledge about a certain subject. For example, many of my students who came from non-English speaking homes had a hard time reading about teddy bears because they didn't have any of that vocabulary. So I remember one time a student was reading about teddy bears, and it was what we call running record, which is they were testing really poorly, and the teacher was actually so concerned that she was thinking of asking for the child to be retained to have another year at school. And what she was doing didn't match what I was seeing in the classroom, and I had done my own running records, and it was much higher because the child had no background knowledge. She had no schema. So if children are able to read about something they're interested in or they have a lot of background knowledge in, they can actually read at a higher reading level. Same if the child has some support. So some of the really famous books in the United States are graphic novels. That means they're books with pictures, and I actually wrote one. They're books that have a lot of pictures. And if the child has picture support, the child can read at a higher level. So when we talk about reading levels, they're not fixed in stone. In other words, children can go up a little bit if they have a lot of schema. If it's something that's really technical or they don't know anything about, they may need to go down a little bit. And that's something that schools don't understand. And many schools have these very strict rules that a child can only read within their learning level, what we call as DPD, zone of proximal development. For example, if a child's reading level is measured to be a 2.1, that child can only read at a 1.8 to 2.4 maybe. There's a very strict band that child can read in. But actually that child can read a lot higher if it's something the child is interested in and likes. So some of the books that children really like in the United States, like Captain Underpants and Ricky Ricotta, those are books that children can access even if their reading level is lower for the most part, because the vocabulary is very basic. They're series books, so there's something over and over, same characters, about the same plots, and they have a lot of picture support. So when we talk about that, students' reading levels can vary based on what they are reading. So that's what I have for today. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about vocabulary. Vocabulary and comprehension go hand in hand, so I hope you'll join me then. If you're interested in literacy and literacy from a global perspective, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time, keep learning.